Welcome into the PFF podcast. Steve Palazzolo here, filling in for the vacationing Mike Renner. I don't know why Mike is taking vacation during draft season, but he asked for a day or two off, so I'm filling in as host this week, and filling in my role as the complimentary role, the equal role though, Josh Liskowitz, PFF analyst. Josh, welcome in to the PFF podcast. It's our draft episode of the week, so welcome in.
Thanks for having me, Steve, but vacation?
I don't understand.
I know I've not quite been here 2 years. I wasn't told about this.
You don't get vacation. You get a couple days off around the 4th of July, and that's pretty much it.
But I hate fireworks.
Yeah, then you can work. You can watch more film.
Okay, that works.
So that's where we are. Renner's taking some time off. We'll see if we can manage without him. I don't really have a hot take planned either, so I don't know what that's going to look like. We might just have to make one up on the go. But I want to start with this, Josh. Since we have you on here, you have an interesting background in history, and I think everybody that's come through PFF has our own unique background in history. I wanted to tap into yours a little bit. You started out more in the scouting community before we plucked you out, brought you into the PFF family a couple of years ago. Give us just a quick synopsis of where you were, what you were doing, and then we'll talk a little bit about what, maybe how things have changed now, or your view of the game, maybe how you watch the game a little bit differently.
Sure. I think in some respects, I probably have Matt Millen to thank for getting me into football.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, that's...
the architect of the 0-16 yes, Detroit Lions.
Exactly. And the reason that is I grew up a Lions fan, went to Michigan, grew up in Michigan, went to University of Michigan, like I said, but never really ever considered football a career. That was just something that players did, and then they'd go on to coaching. And as much as I watched and loved it and had kind of a analytical take when I tried to watch games, never really thought of it as a career. But the draft became more and more interesting because, well, the Lions were more and more often picking in the top 5.
Yes.
So that became...
usually a receiver.
Yes, usually receiver, which obviously was frustrating. Well, let's be honest, every pick was frustrating. But that's kind of the whole point, is that the draft kind of became the Super Bowl for the Lions and for me. So I paid more attention, was really interested in why is Matt Millen so bad at drafting? Why are certain teams always good at drafting? Why are they picking guys that they'll get mocked on ESPN and they won't like them, and all of a sudden they'll turn into great players? How is that process happening? Especially because being from Michigan, being a college football guy as well, seeing the two merge. In particular, I know this is near and dear to your heart. I was a freshman at Michigan when Brady was a senior. So understanding at the time that I didn't really know anything about scouting and how that worked, it still seemed very, very odd to me that someone that could produce like he did his senior year at Michigan could go 199th overall like Tom Brady did. So that kind of got me interested. Eventually, I took actually a class on scouting, and I was hoping through the class I would learn methods on scouting and kind of start to meet the right people that could get me pointed in the right direction. And the best part about this class I took through Sports Management Worldwide was you get an hour chat each week with an expert in the field. And the expert in my field was Russ Landy. He was an NFL scout for 10 plus years and just a wealth of knowledge of the industry of everything football, not just scouting. But I built a rapport with him well beyond the class, and he eventually kind of took me under his wing. He invited me to a Senior Bowl one year, and I went and did some work for him there. Then I started scouting for him, worked a draft for him a couple years, and I wrote reports for him several years. Well, through that, Twitter, social media, making a presence, I was able to...
good old Draft Twitter.
Draft Twitter. Draft Twitter is where it kind of started.
The community.
Yes, and really that's where I met you.
Yep.
On the interwebs.
We all go way back on the interwebs.
We do.
Due to Draft Twitter. It is a good connection, though. You exchange a lot of ideas. You just get a lot of people talking about football. A lot of bitter people because you're talking about your evaluations against other people's evaluations. It gets interesting sometimes. But overall, a good, respectful place to just discuss football and particularly the draft.
Yeah. And so that's what I love about the community is the civil end of it.
Right.
When you can have these discussions, bounce different ideas off people, and then you end up going to events like where I first met you the first time was a Combine a few years ago. We won't get down into all the shenanigans that happened while we were there, but that was my introduction to you and Neil. And I guess you could probably speak more to it, but once PFF decided, okay, it's time to expand to college, I'd like to think one of the first people that you called to talk about that.
Yeah, we went to, grading every player in college in 2014, needed to really expand the team and expanded the way we grew the business and went a little bit more outside the company more than we had in the past, and added you in there and added Jordan Blocker in there. And so far, so good, I think, Josh. So far, so good. My question for you, though, how you've been here now 2 years, how have things changed for you as far as the way you see the game and perhaps the way player evaluations work in your mind? Because I think for years, PFF would always say, we're not scouts. We're doing something completely different. We're grading production. And especially when now you have our college data, there's still that interpretation of the data, interpretation of the grades, figuring out where guys fit at the next level. There's still a lot that goes into that. But where do you think you've perhaps either grown or changed or just had slightly different perspective now after a couple of years at PFF?
Sure. There's a couple different changes with that. And in particular, because when I was evaluating for Russ, I'm trying to project what these guys are going to do, what these guys are doing at the college level. How does that translate to the next level?
Right.
When really at the core of PFF is, does it get the job done?
Right.
It's, yes, certainly there's some competition level and all that involved, but it's not as much about technique, which I was versed on, and that's kind of where my background was. I could tell you individually what a guy, what it should look like he should be doing physically, but I couldn't really tell you the big picture. So I couldn't tell you run schemes. I couldn't break that down at all. Coverage schemes, I would have had trouble with that as well. Yep. And because of everything we do, that brought that into it, and it gave me a much broader depth and understanding of what exactly everybody on the field is trying to accomplish on every given play. And I think that by itself really helped out my evaluation process.
So now how do those two schools of thought now marry into what we're doing right now? It's draft season. We have all of these different grades on players. And for us at PFF, it's not as pure as, well, this is our top-ranked guy, therefore he'll be number one on our board. This guy had the second best grade, he'll be number two on the board. There's so many different ways to slice this now because we have 3 years of data. So say a guy like Jordan Willis, who graded extremely well for us, well, he also didn't grade very well in 2014, and he graded okay or well in 2015, and then he was unbelievable in 2016. So you have multiple years of information now. And then there's the how. How did he win? Where did he win? Well, he beat up on Big 12 right tackles. How much do you dock him for that? How much did his production grade come from there? So there's still many, many variables that go from taking a guy's numbers and stats and grades and trying to translate that into a draft board, so to speak, and ranking these guys. So how have you seen us, our ability to just marry those two things, what we're seeing on tape, the pure production grade versus, maybe that projection forward, a little bit of the technique stuff and some of the more scouty type of stuff that is more of your background?
Sure. I think merging the two allows us to kind of get the why out of it a little bit better, because we see the production, we know what they did. Now we can go back, especially this time of year, and I can use my background and what I had and figure out the why as to why they're why they're grading like that. Why Cam Robinson, Alabama tackle. You instead of just looking at his numbers saying, okay, they're inconsistent and leave it at that. Well, why is he inconsistent? Now I can go back to the film and I can see, okay,
right.
He lunges, he bends at the waist, he loses balance, and I can put all those other pieces in there.
And that shows up in those grades where
exactly.
he's been talked about as a top 10 pick by a lot of people. In our grades, we're saying, whoa. He has never played like a top 10 pick, never even played like a first rounder, other than maybe a stretch of play as a true freshman. So it is adding that why, and that's what we're doing with PFF Draft Pass and our player profiles, where we're trying to add some notes that give you some context as to why a guy graded as he did. PFF Draft Pass, which everybody needs to pick up. over at profootballfocus.com/draftpass17. It's taken off. We've got April 3rd as our next edition of players. We'll get up to about 200 or so scouting profiles, which I promise will be the most unique just compilation of data that you can find on the draft class. Already some great stuff there, and appreciate those who have already subscribed. So that's what you're saying with Cam Robinson, is that, seeing where our grade is and then figuring out the why behind it that leads to that inconsistency, and say, hey, let's pump the brakes a little bit on that top 10 hype that Robinson's gotten from some people.
Yeah, and I think the fact that we have the data behind it, it gives a lot more credence to us being able to say, well, see, we physically can show you the inconsistency because it's backed up in that data. It's just not just a matter of saying that. Look, ultimately, there are going to be guys, and I'm not saying Cam Robinson is necessarily one of them, but there's going to be guys that NFL teams are going to gamble on that aren't going to grade out as higher in a system, and they might turn into great players. But I think we're able to highlight exactly that process quite a bit better because of that data behind it, because we have, it's more than just words. We have the background and the work actually behind it.
Yeah, and I always view it as, it's not just taking a guy's overall grade and saying, well, he must be good. I think there's deep down data that you can look at as well, where it's, okay, maybe if I just take this guy's top plays, what I call big time throws for quarterbacks and turnover worthy throws for quarterbacks. Those are their highest graded or their lowest graded plays, but each position has a level of those. If I took all of Cam Robinson's best blocks, there might be data in there that says, you know what, a lineman that has a high percentage of these, call them big time blocks, which not everybody loves. I put big time in front of everything. But these unbelievable run blocks and, the best of Cam Robinson, maybe that actually does project forward better at that particular position. There's still so much for us to tap into this data that will help us sort through some of these guys. It's not as clean as just, here's this overall grade, it's good, therefore he'll be good. There's so much more information within our database to still tap into, and we're still learning where to tap into it. And that's why later on in the show, we'll have a few, guys where we missed, guys where we hit in our old scouting report section. I'm trying to keep the same format with Mr. Renner on vacation. Mike, I hope you're listening. We're just trying to keep this in the same format as you. So that's interesting stuff, Josh, just seeing how we mesh, those two things, the scouting, projecting forward with the pure production grade at PFF. I want to get into what I think is one of the biggest storylines in the draft. And it's every time I go through a mock draft, and I copped out last time on the mock draft, but every time I get to number 2, there's every year you get to there's a mock draft, you're doing a mock draft, and there's always like a point where it just gets difficult. In most mock drafts in past years, it's like 6, 7, 8. You have a good feel for where the first few picks are going to go, but this year, it starts right at number 2. And I sit down and I'm like, all right, I'm doing my mock draft, and I type in Myles Garrett, number 1, boom, I'm on a roll, here we go. Number 2, I have no idea who I'm going to go with. And again, in past drafts, you might have 5 or 6 just blue chip elite talents, and it's just, how do I shuffle these guys in the top 5 or 6? And then I start stalling out at 7, 8, 9, and you figure out where guys are going. This draft is weird. Who is the second best player in the draft? That, I think, is the big question. I copped out in my last mock draft with the 49ers. I said, you know what? I don't know that they're going to really force a quarterback because of, John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan basically signing these 6-year deals. They're going to be there forever. They don't have to force a quarterback. I'm just going to trade back, pretend the Jets trade up. They get Mitchell Trubisky. They're more willing to take a chance on a QB. So I copped out of the 49ers pick. But let's get back to it. If we're the 49ers, you have to pick somebody. You're the number. Ideally, you do trade down in this draft. Who the heck is the second best player in the draft? This one's tough.
It really is. And you look at the teams that even in January, or the players that we thought in January should be up there. Jonathan Allen from Alabama. Obviously, insane production. Position 2 years in a row in the first round.
And usually that doesn't matter. Like for me,
right,
I'm just like, grab the best players, figure it out. But this is very difficult when they already have DeForest Buckner from last year, Eric Armstead from the year before. They drafted those guys to be 3-4 defensive ends. Now they're moving to a 4-3.
Yep.
But you still don't have this clean fit for Jonathan Allen. I guess going to a 4-man line, you could have him as a base defensive end, kick him inside. But you're still getting a little bit redundant with their previous first-round picks. And I think that's part of the issue with slotting Allen in there.
And not to mention the fact that he didn't really test very well. Certainly didn't test like a top 5 guy.
And we talked about this last week on the podcast, which you should definitely check out. Make sure you're downloaded and subscribed to the entire PFF podcast feed. But we talked about this with Mike last week, and it was, does the testing really matter? Maybe, maybe not for an interior defensive lineman, but boy, do teams really want that confirmation with what you see on tape. And with Allen, for me, I don't think it matters a ton because of the way he wins, uses his strength and his leverage. He knows how to shed blocks. He's better at he'd rather engage and then shed a block and make a play rather than maybe shooting gaps where you want to see a more athletic presence. So I don't think the combine killed him in my mind, but teams really want to see that, right? With a top 5 pick, they want to see that athleticism match up with what they see on tape.
Yeah, and that's why I don't think you talk about copping out last week in your mock draft. I think ultimately, especially when you're talking about quarterbacks, there's going to be one that one of those quarterback-hungry teams falls in love with.
Right.
And I think there's a very high probability that they are going to have the chance to trade out of that or someone trading up for a quarterback. So that's very possible. So let's look at some of the other guys, though, that are possibilities there. Reuben Foster.
I put him there in my previous mock at number 2.
And I love him as a player. Everything on the field, he does on the field. Yep. He does exactly what you could possibly envision.
So fun to watch.
But the problem is, he's an inside linebacker. So you and I have had this discussion about, do we need to start valuing these guys like Reuben Foster more because of their abilities in coverage? Does that all of a sudden elevate what their stock is? Then you've got to factor in all the stuff that happened at the combine with him.
Or that didn't happen because he went home. He got sent home early.
So is there an issue there that San Fran's got to be worried about? Is it something that's going to keep him from going number 2 overall? Because, again, number 2 overall, you want to make sure you got the right guy.
Yeah, and people were already criticizing me a little bit for putting him at number 2 overall. The linebacker position's devalued and all that stuff. But it's not if you've got the 3-down guy, like you said, the coverage ability, the blitzing ability. If you truly know you have a 3-down linebacker in the NFL these days, I am more than willing to take a top 5 pick on him. If he's Patrick Willis, if he's Navarro Bowman, those former 49, well, Bowman's still there, but he's not the same player. But when they were in their heyday as 2 of the best linebackers in the league, they're at number 2 for the Niners.
And then let's go to another defensive lineman.
Who else you got?
We've loved this guy all year long. Doesn't have the super elite measurables, though, but Derek Barnett from Tennessee. Right. Really, he's been about the most productive edge player, really, the last couple of years.
Production right up there with Myles Garrett.
It really
for 3 straight years, 2014, 15, and 16. They've been right up there together. In the SEC, Vols fans, I know you're listening. You guys keep telling us, well, he's got twice as many sacks in SEC play as Myles Garrett. Everybody goes to the sacks, and at PFF, we're focused on not just sacks, but pressures and disruption. But when you add it all up, Barnett is extremely productive, but same thing as Jonathan Allen. He doesn't have that Myles Garrett type of athleticism that makes you feel comfortable that when the athleticism and the production match up that well, you feel much better about the pick because it's just another box that you're ticking.
Yeah, that leads us to the guy that I would probably take if I were San Francisco.
Oh, you have someone.
I do have someone. Not on your original list of 3. I would probably take Jamal Adams, the safety from LSU. Ooh. Whether you're going to play him at corner, we talked a little bit about him on the short last week we did together in terms of his ability to play corner, both in the slot, both outside, off, man, zone. He can play it all. Aggressiveness against the run. Don't know if I want him in the box too much, especially if he has to take on blockers. But still, at the same time, he's not a 4-3 guy. He's not super elite fast, but you watch his playing speed, his instincts, his ability to break and close, change directions, all that's elite on the field. I think that's a guy that you take at number 2.
No, don't forget, San Francisco is going to that Seattle type of scheme. So for Adams, to slot in there, he's going to be the Cam Chancellor role. So
Yeah.
is that a place where you're really comfortable with him? Is he more of a guy that needs to play in more of a split safety type of role where he could play? I think he could play, half field type of coverages, dabble in some center field type stuff. But either way, he's a versatile player. But are you comfortable with him in that scheme with San Francisco? Playing with him as the strong safety in that Cam Chancellor type of role.
That's a fair point, and I would say I'm probably not comfortable with him in that role, but I think it's one of those things where at some point you need to stop trying to fit the player into your system and find a way to just put your player in the best position possible and create the system around that.
That's what I said. Get the best players and and build around them. Absolutely.
Exactly, and I think Jamal Adams is that kind of player where there's so many different things he can do that I'm not really too worried about him coming up and just thumping.
So what about another name that is getting mocked there? A couple other names that are getting mocked there. Solomon Thomas from Stanford. I mean, we come across as Solomon Thomas haters because, for me, I've put him around 15 overall. I know some other guys within PFF might like him a little bit more. I think the thing that's keeping me from calling him a top 10 pick is I don't know how elite he is as a pass rusher. I've been seeing J.J. Watt comparisons, and that's just not fair. So I just don't know if he can rush the passer at high enough level to warrant a top 10 pick, never mind a top 2 pick. And then you're talking about this four-man front. Is he a base defensive end at 270 pounds? He played on the interior at Stanford and did very well. He was our top run defender in college football last year, won the PFF College Award for best run defender in all of college football, and he did it while playing on the interior at about 270 pounds at Stanford, sheds blocks, does everything you're looking for, holds up against double teams even when he was playing nose tackle. But at the NFL level, probably more of a base defensive end, play the run well out there, but where does he rush the passer? Does he rush the passer well enough to warrant a top 10 or even a number 2 overall pick? That's my big question with Solomon Thomas.
No, I think those are legit questions that you have. The thing I love about him, and actually you talk to Sam Munson, and he probably varies a little bit differently because he thinks he's more explosive than I do.
Yeah.
What I really love is his ability to just stack and shed blockers at the point of attack. He's so physical, so violent with his hands, he's able to do that, which tells you that he should be able to translate that into a variety of pass rush moves, whether he's working on the edge or inside. I don't know that he's got that explosion to hit the edge consistently. He's going to have to rely on those hands to really get the job done from that position. And then again, we talked about San Francisco. What have they done the past 2 years? Is he a similar player to what they've had before?
Right.
Is it, again, yet another player that doesn't quite fit naturally in the 43 that they're transitioning to? I think there's too many question marks for me to think that Solomon Thomas is the guy for them.
So the one point that Mike brought up on the podcast last week, and by the way, Sam has called him, we compared him to Michael Bennett, and I think you see some Michael Bennett comps every year, but Sam does see him as a Michael Bennett type of player who could rush from the interior and be effective. But Mike made the point last week, we've seen, and this is again using our data to kind of project guys forward, we've had a history of guys who are really good run defenders develop. So it's kind of like if you're an elite run defender and you at least have this baseline of pass rush ability, and ability I'm saying PFF grade behind it. So a guy who's not an incompetent pass rusher from a grade standpoint, but has a decent pass rush grade. In an elite run grade, we've seen Khalil Mack turn that good pass rush grade into an elite pass rush grade to match his elite run stopping grade. We've seen Donnell Hunter come out of LSU with a very good run grade, a good pass rush grade, and at the NFL level, kind of merged both into becoming a complete player. So my point is, Thomas might be that guy who has this elite run stopping grade. He's got a good pass rushing grade and has enough explosiveness and measurables, because that's one of the things that Hunter and Mack also have. Maybe he does take that big step as a pass rusher and it meshes together, and then you have that elite player. So maybe I'm talking him into the top 10, Josh. Am I talking myself into this at this point?
At this point, you want him over Garrett number 1, I believe.
Yeah, I've got Solomon Thomas as the top player in the entire draft now. One other guy to highlight, Marshawn Lattimore, cornerback from Ohio State. I considered him. I really think it's a deep corner class, and the more you watch these guys, I think Lattimore might just have the best total package. We have him number 1 right now. I love the way he moves. He's 6 foot tall. He can run. Love the way he stays on top of deep routes. I think he can play multiple coverages. And again, we're talking this San Francisco scheme, but they're going to this cover 3, cover 1 scheme where you're going to have to play some press man. You have to play off. You have to break on the ball and off coverage. I think Lattimore has the skills to do it all, but I don't know if I love him as the number 2 overall pick. That's what I just keep coming back to. Do I love this guy as the number 2 overall pick? Can I trade down to 5 or 6 and still get one of these guys? I think that still is the ideal scenario for the Niners.
Yeah, I would agree. I think ultimately priority is getting out of that pick.
You need a partner, though.
No, you do
need a partner. That's always the case.
But again, I think when you don't have a ton of elite players at all these different positions, you have a lot of very, very good players. But when you don't have a lot of elite players, that's going to bump a position like quarterback up. We might not think quarterbacks necessarily warrant that high a pick, but ultimately the value is always there. So I think that's probably what's going to end up happening. You're going to see a team, whether it's the Jets, maybe the Bears say, you know what, we need to make sure we get it. We'll jump one spot. Even something like that for San Francisco.
What about the Chargers?
Sure.
I feel like
the Chargers at 7, yeah.
The class of 2004 quarterback class. So you're Phillip Rivers, Ben Roethlisberger, Eli Manning. I know that the Giants and Steelers are at the lower end of the first round. The Chargers are sitting at 7. I think it's time for those teams to start looking at the QB of the future. And is it this draft? Is it next draft? But I think those teams are in a very interesting spot these next couple of years. When do they start saying, all right, it's time to get the Phillip Rivers succession plan in place? Same thing with Roethlisberger. Same thing with Eli Manning. Perhaps the same thing with Drew Brees and the Saints. They're doing a lot of work on the quarterback class.
They have an elite backup.
Oh, Landry Jones. That was some prominent former general manager's top quarterback. I will not name names, but top quarterback in the draft a couple of years ago, Mr. Polian. But I won't name names. So, yeah, I think it's just time to start looking to the future with a lot of those teams, and that's what makes the top 10. What about Buffalo? I mean, they have Tyrod Taylor, but I still look at having Tyrod as, well, he's your guy, but it's an open relationship, right? We're still kind of looking on the side and looking for someone else. So I think all of those teams have to do their due diligence, and if they fall in love with a Mitch Trubisky or a Mitchell Trubisky or a Deshaun Watson or a Patrick Mahomes or a Deshaun Kaiser, whoever it may be, maybe Arizona too, they're looking for their Carson Palmer replacement.
Right.
I think some of those teams that have a quarterback in tow are going to start looking to potentially make a move. Are you of the belief that you just go get your quarterback? Doesn't matter where you take him? Or do you play the board? We discussed this earlier in the pod, too.
Late first-round quarterbacks, I think there's a little bit of leeway. But once you really get into the top 20, if you're taking a quarterback at 19, it might as well be at number 1 overall. Obviously, there's a money difference, and that helps. Not as much as it was 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. But at the same time, when you're taking a quarterback in the top 20, you are saying he is the face of our franchise. So to me, it doesn't really matter whether you're taking him at 2 overall, whether you take him a little bit later. If you're willing to take him anywhere in that realm, take him at 2 if you're there. You just got to go get your guy.
But my thing is with this now, it's easier to get out. It's easier to get away from the quarterback when you miss. And that's why I mocked Deshaun Watson to the Jaguars at 4. Even though just 3 years ago they drafted Blake Bortles. So we're 3 years into Blake Bortles' career. And if this was 10 years ago, think about the Lions and Matthew Stafford. He had his ups and downs early in his career. Mm-hmm. And he was like the highest paid quarterback in the NFL for a while, or close to it, because they were just right. How long was it exactly?
Was he the highest paid? But was Sam Bradford up there after that?
And Bradford,
so he was the year after.
But you had, I don't know if they were the highest paid exactly, but you have Matthew Stafford, you have Sam Bradford, and you are married to that guy for the life of like a 5+ year contract sometimes. Now you've got 5-year contracts, you've got less money that you're really dedicated to this guy. They've really dedicated to this guy. So if you do have a Blake Bortles and you just invested in him in 2014, you might be able to just grab another guy here in 2017, whereas years ago, maybe you couldn't. So maybe that changes your quarterback strategy a little bit, where you don't have to force it and you just kind of like let the board fall to you. But it's an interesting conversation to have, because it's strategy, how you value quarterbacks. check out one of the earlier podcasts. Mike and I did discuss it quite a bit. So I want to move on. Like I said, we are sticking with Renner's schedule here. This is the way he likes to build the podcast. So I'm his wishes. We're listening to his wishes. He likes to discuss the players that are rising and falling. So that's what we're going to do. I call this the recency bias section, where it's basically guys that we just recently saw who in our mind are rising or falling. I'll let you start. So Josh, based off guys you've been watching, you've been scouting certain positions, who do you see as just rising right now that's just jumping off the tape and maybe a little bit higher? You're either higher on him than other people or just higher than you previously thought you would be.
For my riser, I'll say this. I think this is the field catching up to me because I feel like I've been up on this guy a long time, since the beginning of the season. We talked about Sam Monson earlier, and I know he's in full agreement with me here. He always refers to him as RB number 4 from Ohio State, and that's Curtis Samuel. I just think when you have a tool like that who can run 4.32 in the 40, he can run out of the backfield, which, again, we're not really sure what he is at the NFL. Is he going to be a running back? Is he going to be receiver in the slot outside? I think he can do all of that, and that's okay. I don't have a problem with not having a clearly defined role for him yet.
You need a team that's going to use him properly.
Oh, there's no question about that. There's no question about that. He has to go to a place that's going to be willing to put him in a variety of roles. And not just try and make him an ex-receiver. That's not going to work with him. But if he goes to a team, and I think probably second round at this point.
Really?
I really do think he's worth going that high, considering his athletic profile, his ability to make...
he's a smooth route runner. He's pretty good.
Yeah, he really is.
As a receiver, good in the open field. I guess my question with Curtis Samuel, you mentioned that skill set. Is that not the same skill set he's battling now? Christian McCaffrey and maybe even Alvin Kamara a little bit. Kamara maybe doesn't have the same pure wide receiver type of ability. I think McCaffrey does. I keep making the point that McCaffrey, he'd be like a second-round wide receiver if he was just a receiver. I think he's that smooth out there. So I think Samuel versus McCaffrey versus Alvin Kamara, to a lesser degree, I feel like they're all battling for draft position and trying to, it's all about teams taking advantage of those skill sets, though, to make sure that they maximize their value.
Well, ultimately, you've listed 3 players, but there are 32 teams. And certainly there are teams in the league that have players existing like that.
Right.
We can go through comps if you want. That's not totally relevant here. But the fact of the matter is multiple teams can use guys like that. So it's not just one of those things where, McCaffrey's on the board at 9 to Carolina. I'm just making something up.
Right.
That's it. No, you can get Kamara. You can get Samuel in the second round. I think all 3 of those guys, sure, they're in the same boat. Maybe you're getting similar players, but at the same respect. I think they're all valued high enough to where they're all going to go roughly in that range of the first 60, 70 players.
Yeah, I like it. It makes sense. But like I said, I think they're still battling a little bit for position.
Sure.
Some teams might like Samuel a little bit higher than Kamara, and I think McCaffrey is the potentially the top running back. We've been debating this one behind the scenes at PFF. Is McCaffrey? Have we been too low on him? Production wise, he's been great. Tears up the combine. Backs up the fact that you think he's this great change of direction guy. Has it. Smooth receiver. I think he can run any scheme to a point. Is he the best running back in the draft? I don't know. Who's falling in your mind, on your board? I'm reading the name right now. I'm seeing it. It's an interesting one.
Yeah, and this is someone that you and I had talked about a couple years ago. I want to give a shout out to John Abbott, who did our original grading on him, and I think you and I were both really surprised to see.
Why does he hate Buddha so much?
What's wrong with Buddha? Why does he hate him? Because you watch him on broadcast, and he's just constantly flashing.
Right.
He's making all these plays in the box. He's coming in like a missile. It's clear his competitiveness is off the charts. He wants to blow up every single play, and he made a ton of plays at Washington in every phase of the game. But when you really dig into his film, I have real concerns about how he translates to the next level. He's so often out of control. when he's coming forward. So while he graded fine, I think he actually graded in the top 10 in safeties. In
he made a lot of plays.
Efficiency.
He made a lot of plays.
But in tackling efficiency, but then you watch him play, and you're like, there's no way his level of intensity attacking forward, that's sustainable. He's going to miss tackles.
But even if it does, all right, let's say he continues to tackle extremely well. Even if it does, I still think there are other concerns with his game. Even if we give him the fact that in our scouting report we said he attacks downhill extremely well, he blows up screens, he blows up blockers, and he does this usually playing out of the slot. That is very Tyrann Mathieu-like.
Yeah.
And I think stylistically, he will remind you of Tyrann Mathieu beyond just the number 32. But I think there are other concerns with Buddha, right? Other than just, the way he works downhill, because he's had some success there.
Yeah, I think there are some real legitimate concerns about him in coverage. First of all, you have his size. This shows up repeatedly on film, where he's in position to make a play on a contested ball, and the receiver or tight end is just bigger than him. They're able to make it despite them hitting him, despite him trying to work his way around. He just doesn't have the length and strength to consistently break up those contested balls. And then when he's off coverage or zone, he just seems a click late at times.
Right.
Like his transition is just slow, and he doesn't really have that makeup speed to make up the ground. And that allows quarterbacks to kind of target him, pick on him, and kind of complete a lot of things underneath him. So I don't think he's quite as well versed in coverage as we may have expected based off the analytics. And I think translating that to the next level is going to be even harder for him.
Yeah, and I think he's a guy that role-wise will still match with what Tyrann Mathieu is, and that's you could play him as an early down safety, probably trust him in too high coverages to a degree, work downhill in the box a little bit, use that ability to work downhill, play in the slot. But look, Tyrann Mathieu grades extremely well for us, even coverage-wise, because he makes a lot of plays, but he also gets beaten quite a bit in coverage. Gave up 6 touchdowns a couple of years ago. I see Baker also losing to maybe those better slot receivers or big slot receivers, the Marcus Colston types that teams are putting in the slot, or if he does have to match up on a tight end in coverage. So I certainly see those concerns, either his ability to match up with the shiftier slot receivers or the bigger receivers, where, as you mentioned, the size does come into play.
Yeah, and I think you said the key word there, matchups. I think when teams see him opposite, they're going to try and exploit that. They might like to have their tight ends in line normally, but when they see him out there and likely manning the slot, they're going to pull him out and say, okay, Buddha, take on my 6'5", 260-pound tight end. May not move as fast, but you're not going to be able to stop him. And I think that's going to be a real issue.
And that's why Baker is a little bit lower on our draft board than others, a little bit lower in our safety rankings, which you could find at profootballfocus.com/NFL-draft. That's where all the fun is. That's where Draft Pass lives. Get your Draft Pass now. Join in the fun. I've been asking all of our Draft Pass subscribers, give me the information that you found most interesting so far. I love hearing what people have learned because I learn something every day from it. There's so much information in there, and it's the stuff that fuels our scouting reports, that fuels our evaluations. I hope everybody gets involved with the PFF Draft Pass. It is a bargain. We've got some NFL GMs that have subscribed, some prominent NFL draft gurus that have subscribed, so I think it's well worth its $19.99 price. I'm going to get into my risers and fallers quickly, though. My rising player, and shout out to Billy Moy, who's been doing our tight end evaluations, and he keeps banging the table for Gerald Everett from South Alabama. And I think the more you watch Everett, I understand he's a little undersized, has small hands, all that. Those were issues. Small hands at the Senior Bowl. These were issues. 228 pounds at the Senior Bowl, even though he played closer to 240 during the season. He just looks like such a really good athlete. I do think he is in that Evan Ingram type of range as far as matchup possibility, matchup type of guy that can play in the slot, can play in line a little bit, can play on the move. The question for both Gerald Everett and Evan Ingram is how well can they block as slightly undersized tight ends. I think Everett can at least do a reasonable job, especially as a move tight end or a guy that you use out of the backfield. I think the more you watch him, he's just such a smooth pass catcher. He's rising in my mind. And he's a guy that's graded well for us over the last few years, but you always have questions. It's competition level, and they used him essentially as a glorified slot at South Alabama. But I definitely see some of that athleticism, which he was really good at the combine. He really showed well at the combine from an athleticism standpoint. I see that translating at the next level.
Steve, let's talk about that a little bit in terms of the tight end class, because really there's a little bit of everything in this class.
Yes.
You have guys at the top that can do both in terms of blocking, inline, out in space, movement guys, and almost all of them really good receivers as well.
Right.
I think it's important that we start differentiating instead of just calling a tight end, because there's so many different skill sets. But at what point does an Evan Ingram, does your guy Gerald Everett become a slot receiver?
I think it depends on the team. I mean, I think we dealt with this with Devin Funchess a couple years ago. When you look at Funchess, if he went to the Saints, he would probably play that Marcus Colston role, which is a lot more in the slot and just be a big slot that creates mismatches against defensive backs. No team would ever really count him as a tight end from a personnel standpoint. And then he's with Funchess is with Carolina. They use him as just an outside wide receiver. So I think the team dictates that a lot. With Gerald Everett, I think if you have a team that uses him as a tight end, then it starts to dictate to the defense, hey, they line him up in line. Do we really want to put a corner on him, or do we need to put a linebacker or a safety on him? And then you create run-pass mismatches. So I think a lot of it's on how teams use him. But as far as labeling him, if you labeled him a slot receiver, I wouldn't hate it that much. When people said Devin Funchess is a tight end, I don't think you need to label him. If he gets drafted and a team decides to use him as a tight end, then we see what happens. With Gerald Everett, I don't think we need to label him. Right now he's a tight end until some team says, hey, he's a slot receiver. Then he becomes a slot receiver, and you hope that he can still create those same types of mismatches against maybe a better slot corner, where I still think the best value of him is second tight end, move guy, create mismatches, dictate to the defense, put a linebacker, put a safety on him, and then you move him around formationally and try to take advantage of that mismatch in the pass game. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think that kind of makes my broader point that the game is so specialized now.
Absolutely.
And every site you go to, and certainly we have our own, we're just ranking. We rank top 10, top 15 tight ends or whatever. Right. But the real fact of the matter is they all have very different skill sets. And ultimately, each team is going to be looking for something a little bit different. So as opposed to saying, well, the Packers reached by taking our 10th tight end
right
as the second tight end overall, when really what he does...
More like how they're going to use him, exactly. Where does he fit in? Absolutely. That's where I think, going back to Draft Pass for a minute, and the profiles that we're creating, and also the data that comes out of Draft Pass is what really shows you a guy's value and skill set. Because we're putting the rankings together. Is Gerald Everett better than Evan Ingram? I don't know. They're close. But what do they do differently? Where are they similar? What do the numbers show? What do the scouting reports show? Then you added a guy like Michael Roberts, who I just watched recently from Toledo. Yep. He's a big 270-pounder.
Yeah.
4'8", 6" guy. He's slow. But I think he's a great red zone body. I think he can run block. I think he adds a lot of value to a team as well. He's probably our 10th or 11th tight end as far as pure ranking goes. But I wouldn't hate him being picked up in the same range as a Gerald Everett or an Evan Ingram, because I think in the right role, he can have a lot of success. So it's a great point. I mean, we're obligated to put rankings to these guys, but I think the true value is the context, where these guys win, where they contribute, how they fit in with their teams at the next level. Which brings me to my faller, because I don't know, I hate putting him as a faller because the numbers are so good on him. But I just think, and falling for him is, I think we just had him at 6 or 7 on our wide receiver board. I'm just dropping him down a touch, and it's Carlos Henderson out of Louisiana Tech. The numbers are incredible. Forced twice as many missed tackles as the next closest guy among wide receivers, which I love. My only issue with Henderson is a bit of the route running and the catch radius, which reminds me a little bit of Tavon Austin. So I think it just limits what Henderson can do. So you put the ball in his hands, he's dynamic, he's got good vision in the screen game, He's got good vision with the ball after the catch. He can string together multiple moves. I mentioned how he makes guys miss. He's got the shiftiness to him. That shiftiness also just didn't show up on his in his workout numbers for some reason. And then I just look at when a QB is just off a little bit, accuracy-wise, the catch radius comes into play. The guy's just not making too many plays off of his frame. And that reminds me of Tavon Austin a little bit, where you get the ball in Tavon's hands, he can do some really good things. I just don't think he's the sharpest route runner as far as getting open. And then if you put him on the outside and you try to run comebacks and some of these other outside the numbers types of routes, it's just very difficult to complete passes. I feel like Henderson's going to be that limited, but it does come to your point. If you get him in the right system, the right scheme, the team that's going to use him, he's a valuable player.
And I'll also add that Louisiana Tech loved to use him in the red zone quite a bit as well.
They did.
So it's not just about, well, he made forced 48 missed tackles.
Incredible.
So it's an absurd number, like you said.
13 against UMass alone, which is insane.
Yeah.
Insane.
It's absolutely absurd what he did. I mean, he's basically a running back with the ball. But that being said, it's not just that he's all doing underneath crossing routes and things like that, where he's presented with multiple opportunities to make guys miss on every given catch he makes. He also showed some ability to do some of the red zone stuff too. So that gives me a little bit more hope. But I understand, there's a big transition that he's going to have to make, not just because he went to Louisiana Tech and not Alabama or LSU, but he's got to be able to run all the different routes. And if he doesn't have the super elite athletic profile like we kind of expected based on his elusiveness, that does leave you some level of concern.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, I still love Carlos Henderson. He's just dropping a little bit because I have to put him on this list of receivers and rank them. It's my job. So I'm dropping him just a little bit. Let's move on. Old scouting reports. I think this is Mike's favorite feature. He loves to go back and see where did we miss a little bit and where did we hit. We've only got 3 years of PFF data, but if you go back to year one, it was 2014, and we evaluated the draft classes. And one of the draft picks that we did not like at all was Mario Edwards going to the Oakland Raiders in the second round. We gave it a D back in the day, and I'm going to explain why. Here's what we said. Bit of a surprise, given the talent that was on the board when Edwards was selected high in round 2. You get the sense that the talent is there, but cruised. He cruised at times in college, landed 57th in the class as a pass rusher off the edge, and his pass rush productivity was just 41st. So I think when you look at Edwards and the rumor around Florida State in 2014, remember they were just coming off their national championship in 2013, and guys like Mario Edwards, Eddie Goldman, I think if we had the 2013 data, we would have been a little bit higher on them. We would have liked them better because from what we saw just going back, and we graded the national title game that year, both of those guys looked much better, I thought, in 2013 than they did in 2014. We went by the numbers that we had. Edwards wasn't bad by any stretch in 2014, but when you look at the other players potentially on the board that they could have had, and just the fact that, as I mentioned, 56th as a pass rusher in the edge class that year, 41st in pass rush productivity, he just didn't play like a second-round pick. Now he gets to the NFL, has a solid rookie season. He was one of the better, you take Khalil Mack out of the equation, but better players in their front seven in 2015, played banged up in 2016, but we'll chalk up Edwards as a miss historically because we were certainly lower on him than others and low compared to what we saw on the field in 2014 when he was in college.
Yeah, just to give it a little context as to how he did his rookie year. Started off the season and snaps were kind of sparing, but once he became really a full-time player for them in the middle of the year, he had, 6 straight games where he had at least 3 pressures.
He looked really good
in all those games, and he graded extremely well against the run in just about all of those games. I believe he had some injury issues at the very end of that year as well. Played less than 100 snaps last year, so he's got to get back to that level that he was. But certainly, like you said, being a rookie, you can kind of see that progression he had and that impact he was able to make toward the end of the year.
So that was our miss, Mario Edwards. You could probably say his teammate Eddie Goldman was also a miss. Like I said, I wonder how much of it was Florida State, these guys just not playing as hard, not playing as well in 2014 as they did the previous year. The one guy I think we hit on, though, Henry Anderson out of Stanford, we were pushing him quite a bit. He's like the PFF poster boy, the year one guy that we pushed through the roof, had really good production grades. What we said about him in our, here's our piece that we wrote in 2014, which was the top interior defensive linemen in that draft who we thought were the top players. We listed Danny Shelton, Leonard Williams, Henry Anderson, and Grady Jarrett as the top 4 players in that draft. Of course, Jarrett went in the 5th round. He's been playing really well. We talked about him back on the first draft podcast. But with Anderson, we said he's a good athlete, commits to shooting gaps, which makes him arguably the most disruptive defensive lineman in the entire class. His 12.2 pass rush productivity score against Power 5 teams was comfortably the best among draft-eligible defensive tackles and 3-4 defensive ends. And he was also extremely productive in the run game. So we thought Anderson was a solid, just 3-down player. I think the NFL, he went in the 3rd round. The NFL, as a whole, I think saw him as a 3rd-round type of player. When he got to the NFL, 2015 was solid. He played 452 snaps, was excellent in the run game. He was a good pass rusher, not great. Last year, played through injury, banged up again, good against the run, and solid as a pass rusher. I think I'm a little underwhelmed with his pass rushing prowess so far at the next level compared to maybe what we thought. But he's been excellent against the run, and I think he's poised for a breakout next year because he's been great in the run game. Just want to see that pass rush get back to where we thought it would be coming out of Stanford.
Has to stay in the field as well.
Oh, the injuries have been a major issue. He's only played 760 snaps in his 2 seasons. But when healthy, I think Henry's lived up to the hype where we had him as a first-round caliber player. And when he is healthy, that is the level that he's been playing at.
The interesting thing with him, from my perspective, is evaluating him as a draft prospect predates me being at PFF.
Right.
And I remember this was a guy that we talked about leading up to that draft where you and I really went back and forth on, because I looked at him on film. I saw this, in a lot of respects, unathletic guy. He's constantly on the ground, can't keep his balance.
Oh, scouts loved telling us how often he was on the ground.
Yeah. Oh, it was all the time. He was just burning the worms on the ground, as we like to say. But when you look at the whole package in terms of the productivity, again, it doesn't always matter how you're getting it done. It matters if you're getting it done.
That's what we keep coming back to, I think. Mike and I talked about this a few weeks ago. The how often matters. And I think at PFF, with defensive linemen, we focus more on percentage of wins rather than how bad the loss looks. And then conversely, on the offensive line, it's percentage of losses compared to how good the wins look. So point being, if you're a defensive lineman, and let's just say you rush the passer 40 times and we determine, 7 rushes. If you get 7 good quality pressures out of 40, you're at a top-notch level. Just making up a number right now, but that's pretty close. If you get your 7, no matter when they occur, if you get your 7, doesn't matter how bad the 33 times that you didn't get there, how bad they look. I don't know if it matters. If you're on the floor 10 times, if you get, knocked out of the gap, quite a bit. I mean, gap discipline's important, but it doesn't matter if you're on the ground, if you get your 7 pressures, if you get your disruption. And then from an offensive line standpoint, it doesn't matter if you pancake a guy in pass protection if you're giving up 7 pressures on 40 attempts. So I think that's where we view things, whereas I think when you're scouting and you're trying to look at the quality of losses for a defensive lineman, you're like, oh, this guy's on the ground all the time. It kind of makes you forget the fact that he was disruptive on maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 plays in a game.
It's a little bit of a Moneyball approach to it, really, when you think about it. It both is certainly on the offensive line, defensive line, whether you're talking about like a pitcher versus a hitter.
Right.
But also at the same time, are you just accomplishing the goal that we want you to accomplish? And are you accomplishing it X amount of times? If you're reaching that threshold, then you're probably a pretty good player.
And like I said, I think it's just valuing the wins more.
Mm-hmm.
And using the Moneyball example again, Moneyball for hitters has basically said, I don't care if you strike out. That's an out. An out's an out. Whether you strike out, ground out, fly out, it's an out. For us, we're almost saying if you lose as a pass rusher, it's a loss. Whether you almost get there, whether you're on the ground, whether you
contain,
whether you're just hanging out at the line of scrimmage, that's just a loss. But contain's different too. I mean,
sure.
That's your role. We're not necessarily going to dock you for that, but so we're focused on the wins, and I think it's just where you value certain things. So I think that's what makes some of the way we look at the game a little bit more interesting. Feel pretty good about Henry Anderson and his prospects going forward. I think this is actually really Mike's favorite segment coming up. He likes to put me on the spot. Every segment's Mike's favorite. In honor of Mike, who's texted me multiple times during the show, Mike. Get back to work, man. Get back to work. But every week he likes to put odds on the draft, and I put up some fake Monopoly money, so I'm going to let you put up your fake Monopoly money. The odds on the draft. So in the past, I have put bets on the first running back to be taken, the first quarterback to be taken, when the first kicker comes off the board, and I got some good odds on day 2. I don't love my pick, but I got some good odds on it to make some money. So I'm going to give you some options. First wide receiver off the board. I'll give you 3 options here. We have Mike Williams from Clemson at -200, so we're calling him the favorite at this point. Corey Davis of Western Michigan at +150, and then John Ross of Washington, he of the 4.2240 at the scouting combine at +200 for Ross. Who do you have? This is just predicting the draft, not who your favorite guy is, unless, you could use any strategy you want. But we're trying to say on draft night, who is the first wide receiver taken off the board? With those odds, give me a dollar amount that you're willing to bet, shows your confidence level, and which receiver are you taking?
Here's my approach to this. Normally, this is yours and Renner's baby. So
it is.
You could look at it as you're the Vegas lifer.
I'll still take your money, though.
That's fine.
I'm willing to take your money, even though it's our baby.
But the analogy is this. You're the professional gambler that lives in Vegas full-time. You gamble full-time. I think if that's what you're trying to accomplish, then I think Mike Williams is your pick. I think ultimately that's who I think is going to get taken first.
How much are you willing to put up on that?
But that's the problem. And how much are we going to win with the odds if he's the favorite?
That's why we're gambling
at -200. So for me, being the tourist in this situation, because I'm not the one that's there, I want to win a little bit of money. It might not be the smartest approach.
I like it,
but I think there's probably a somewhat decent chance, especially at these odds, that John Ross could sneak in there.
Wow.
I might put a little bit on John Ross, just because I think when you look at the athletic profile of Corey Davis, well, I think he's the number 1 receiver. I think he's going to end up being the best, most consistent guy of this entire class.
Love Corey Davis.
I don't think he's going to end up being the first receiver. I think teams want those traits too much for him to be the top receiver in this class.
That speed
Ross
will
has
entice
that.
Someone. Yes.
You might have heard about his combine.
I may have heard about it.
4.22.
That's the rumor.
That's pretty fast. And while there's concerns with injuries with him, how that's going to pan out, that might not put him as the first wide receiver. But at the same time, I have a chance to win a little more money. So
+200 on Ross. He's your guy. How much are you going to put up?
I'll put $50 on that.
$50 on John Ross.
Let's do it.
I will collect when Mike Williams gets his name called first. All right, now, this is really Mike's favorite section of the pod. It is the time when we make up a scouting term. Every week we've been doing it, and we've encouraged our millions and millions of listeners to take our term, create a hashtag, ask your favorite draft guru something that involves this term. So past ones include hashtag tackle radius. Last week was hashtag dolphin backer. That's for your short-armed linebackers that have a strong flipper. Pretty clear on that one. We've had some good ones. Balance ratio, Ginsu knife. So today, Josh, I'm going to let you do the honors and give us a nice scouting term to make up, because they all sound made up anyway. So make up a term, and we'll encourage our listeners once again to find, whether it's Mike Mayock, Bucky Brooks, Daniel Jeremiah, and special shout out to Frank. You know who you are, Frank. You've been using these every week. I appreciate your enthusiasm, using the made-up scouting terms. I wish you'd get an answer. I have not seen any of these guys actually get back to you with a good answer. But, all right, Josh, what do you got for us? What's a good made-up scouting term, which you actually kind of put into context and used recently?
I did, and I believe it was on our short about Malik Hooker last week. I did it, and it just kind of was an analogy I came up with on the fly, but I think works really well. When you think about, and this is often to do with safeties, corners, defensive backs, guys that when they go to tackle, they don't bring their arms. And the analogy I came up with was the Wii Avatar, where they just have the little circles for arms, and I called it nub arms.
Nub arms.
So for me, someone with nub arms is someone that does not bring their arms to wrap up and finish tackles. So it's probably
you are demonstrating this for me right now. You're trying to tackle me right now.
I can't do it.
And you can't do it with your nub arms. Hashtag nub arms. That's what we're going with this week?
I think that's it.
So you're saying Malik Hooker.
Malik Hooker
has those nub arms.
Does have a case of nub arms. He's certainly not the only one. There are always plenty of them every year. That's the guy that unfortunately is the guinea pig for
Poor Malik. And I love Malik. So good on the back end, center fielder, ball skills, all of that fun stuff. But he's a nub arm type of guy. And this week, again, find your favorite draft guru, hashtag nub arms. Just roll it right into the conversation. See if anybody, whether it's Matt Miller, Daniel Jeremiah, is it Todd McShay, is it Mel Kiper, who is going to answer your question about your favorite players? Hashtag nub arms. And that'll about do it for us this week. Fun as always. Thanks, Josh, for filling in for Mike. Thanks, Mike, for taking vacation during draft season. And thanks to everyone for listening. Again, we appreciate all of your feedback. Be sure to get the podcast downloaded if you haven't already. Download, subscribe. Be sure to leave a nice 5-star review. And always check out the PFF Draft Pass, profootballfocus.com/DraftPass17. I promise it is worth the price of admission. Not only do you get the draft class's signature stats online, but you also get a downloadable PDF, which we'll update 2 or 3 more times before the draft. I think we made it look pretty nice. We added so much more stuff to it this year. So if you got it last year, you have an idea of what you're getting, but it's even better this year. Plus, you get the online component. So be sure to check it out. And like I said, I want to hear what you guys are learning from it. So if you already have Draft Pass, thank you for subscribing. Thank you for joining the PFF community. Hit me up on Twitter at PFF_Steve and let me know what you've learned. Players that you may have changed your opinion on. The coolest stat that you may have found. I want to hear it because I think there's some really cool stuff to find in Draft Pass. Be sure to follow Josh on Twitter at PFF_Josh. We'll be back here next week, hopefully with Mike Renner back from vacation. Not that I didn't love having you, Josh. You did a great job discussing draft. But thanks, guys, again, and we will chat next week.